The window fogged white before the smoke ever reached her. Halmoni Du sat frozen behind the wheel, one hand pressed flat against the glass, the other clawing at a seatbelt that would not release. Cars slowed on the overpass, windows cracked just enough to catch the smell, and then rolled forward again. Phones rose. Nobody's foot touched a brake pedal for longer than it took to film. Rain came down in sheets thick enough to blur the taillights ahead into red smears, and still, the traffic crawled past a dying engine like it was scenery instead of an emergency. Seoul's rush hour had somewhere to be. An old woman pounding weakly on glass was not going to change anyone's schedule tonight. 15 minutes away, boxed inside his own convoy on a parallel street, Du Junhyuk watched his grandmother's hand slap weakly against fogged glass on a screen held by a man who did not know how to tell his boss the truth. Junhyuk gave the order to move. The order was not fast enough. It never is, for the men who arrive after everything has already happened. Baek Wonseok did not know any of that. He knew a stalled sedan, hazard lights blinking uselessly into gathering rain, and an old woman's palm going still against the window glass. He was 15 minutes late on a delivery that would cost him half a day's pay if he stopped. He stopped anyway. He swung the steel bike lock into the window 3 times before it gave, dragged her through broken glass that opened his forearm to the bone, and got her breathing again on wet asphalt while every phone around him kept recording nothing useful at all. Here is something worth sitting with before this story goes any further. The people who change everything rarely look like they're about to. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe, and really I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Wonseok never asked her name. He wrapped his own jacket around the cut on his arm, called an ambulance with hands that would not stop shaking, and stayed exactly long enough to see her chest rise and fall on its own before he picked his bike back up off the ground. He had a delivery still sitting cold in his bag. He was already going to be fired either way. He never saw the black convoy finally break through the stalled traffic 4 minutes later. He never saw the man who stepped out of the lead car, red hair soaked through, stopping dead at the sight of a shattered window and a bike lock left behind on the wet ground, dark with blood that was not his grandmother's. Junhyuk had not felt his own pulse in 11 years. He felt it now, standing over a stranger's bike lock like it was evidence from a crime scene nobody had reported. Every man in his organization had failed to reach her in 15 minutes. Somebody else had done it in 11 seconds, and then vanished into traffic without leaving so much as a name. His men stood back and said nothing. They had learned over the years exactly how much space to give him when his voice went quiet like this. Quiet was worse than shouting. Quiet meant he was already deciding something. Inside the ambulance, his grandmother reached for his hand and found it cold and closed around a stranger's bike lock instead of hers. She smiled anyway, the way she always did when her grandson forgot how to be soft in front of witnesses. The doors shut before either of them said a word. He picked up the bike lock. The file took 40 minutes to build and told Junhyuk almost nothing worth knowing. Baek Wonseok, 23. A courier route through 3 districts his organization owned buildings on. No family listed. 1 unpaid parking fine, and nothing else in a record that should have taken longer than an hour to compile. Men who worked for Junhyuk usually had something buried under the surface, some leverage he could reach for later if loyalty ever wavered. Wonseok had nothing buried. He had nothing at all, which made him the strangest kind of dangerous Junhyuk had ever encountered. He found him outside his grandmother's hospital room at 2 in the morning, sitting on a plastic chair too small for him, delivery bag still slung across his shoulder, forearm bandaged in gauze that had already started to bleed through. Nobody had asked him to stay. He had simply not left. Nurses passed him twice and offered him water. He drank it and kept sitting there, watching the door like it owed him something it hadn't yet delivered. Junhyuk stood in the doorway a long moment before he spoke. "You could have gone home." Wonseok did not look up right away. She was scared. "Someone should be here when she wakes up." "I'm here." "Then I'll go." He did not move. Junhyuk sat down across from him without meaning to, close enough that the silence between them filled up the whole corridor. He studied the Omega's face for whatever it was that made a stranger break a window for a woman he'd never see again, and found nothing performed in it, nothing waiting for a reward. He had built his life around reading exactly that kind of hidden motive in people, and here, for once, there was none to find. He reached into his coat and set an envelope on the empty chair between them. Thick, heavier than it needed to be for what it was supposed to say thank you for. Won-seok looked at it the way a person looks at something that has personally insulted them. What is that? Your arm, for the bike, for your time. I didn't do it for money. I know, take it anyway. Won-seok stood and the plastic chair scraped loud enough to wake the hallway. You don't know anything about why I did it. His voice stayed low, but something in it had gone sharp enough to cut. I'm not for sale, and I'm not a debt you get to pay off so you can stop thinking about it. He picked up his delivery bag, and for a moment, standing there bleeding through gauze at 2 a.m, he looked less like a man who had nothing and more like a man who had never once needed anything Junhyuk could offer him. Junhyuk sat alone in the corridor after he left, the envelope still sitting untouched on the chair, and understood something that unsettled him more than any threat he'd survived. He had built an entire empire on the belief that everyone could be bought, that every debt eventually found its price. He had just met the first person alive who owed him nothing, wanted nothing, and would not be moved by anything he had. For a man who had never lost a negotiation, it felt uncomfortably close to losing. The black car was already parked outside his building when Won-seok got off shift. He almost walked past it. Then the rear window lowered, and Do Junhyuk sat there in a coat that probably cost more than Won-seok's entire apartment building, looking like he belonged nowhere near this neighborhood and had shown up anyway. Have a proposition, Junhyuk said before Won-seok could ask him to leave. I already told you. I don't want your money. This isn't money. Not exactly. Won-seok crossed his arms, rain still dripping off the edge of his delivery bag. Then what exactly? Junhyuk stepped out of the car, and for a man who commanded rooms with a glance, he looked, just for a second, like he was choosing his next words the way a man diffuses something that could still go wrong in his hands. My grandmother wants to see you again. Properly. Not in a hospital corridor at 2 a.m. Does that need a car outside my building? Because I don't know how else to reach you, and you refuse to answer anything I send in writing. That, at least, was true. Won-seok had deleted 3 messages from an unknown number without opening them, certain they were exactly this. There's a position, Junhyuk continued. Overseeing her care, her company, she likes you. She hasn't liked anyone new in years. I'm a courier. You saved her life with a bike lock. I think you can manage tea and conversation. Something in that almost pulled a laugh out of Won-seok, and he hated how close it came. He looked at this man who solved problems by throwing money and cars and positions at them like sandbags against a flood, and felt, underneath the irritation, something colder and more honest. He did not actually want to say no. I'm not doing this because of you, he said finally. I didn't ask you to. If I take it, nothing changes between us. I'm not yours to manage. Junhyuk's expression didn't move, but something behind his eyes did, quick and unreadable. Understood. Won-seok climbed the stairs to his apartment without looking back, certain he had won something in that exchange, and equally certain he had just lost something too, though he couldn't yet name what. If a story like this one has ever made you want to see 2 people from completely different worlds find their way to each other, this is the part where you tell us. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and stay with us for what happens when Won-seok walks through those gates for the first time. The next morning, the same black car was parked outside his building again. It hadn't moved all night. The gate did not look like it belonged to a criminal. It looked like it belonged to a museum. Won-seok stood in front of it holding a small paper bag of oranges he'd bought on the way, feeling suddenly and completely out of place in his own jacket. A guard at the gate said nothing, only opened it, as if Won-seok's name had already been written somewhere important enough that questions were no longer necessary. Inside, the house was quiet in a way his own apartment never managed to be. An older woman met him in the entryway, sharp-eyed, arms crossed, sizing him up the way a person checks a lock before deciding whether to trust it. You're the courier, she said. It was not a question, Wonsiok. I know who you are. Everyone in this house knows who you are. She studied him a moment longer, then something in her posture eased just slightly. I'm Park Soo-young. I've run this house for 15 years, and in 15 years I have never once seen him bring a stranger through that gate himself. She said it carefully, watching for how he'd take it. Whatever you are to him, you are not nothing. Don't make the mistake of thinking otherwise while you're under this roof. Just here for her, Wonsiok said. Soo-young's mouth twitched, almost a smile. That's what everyone says at first. She waved him further inside. She's been asking for you since sunrise. Don't keep her waiting. She doesn't have patience for people who make her wait. Found Halmoni-do sitting up in a sunlit room, a blanket over her knees, looking nothing like the woman who had gone still behind a fogged window 3 days earlier. Her face lit up the moment she saw him, and she reached for his hand before he'd even crossed the room. There you are, she said, like he was late for something they'd agreed on long ago. Sit. Tell me your name properly this time, none of that hospital nonsense. Wonsiok. Wonsiok. She said it like she was testing whether it fit him. Good, strong name. She patted the seat beside her bed until he sat and held onto his hand a beat longer than a stranger should. You have kind eyes. My grandson forgets that kind eyes matter more than sharp ones. Junhyuk appeared in the doorway just in time to hear that and stopped there instead of coming in. He didn't used to be so cold, you know, she continued, entirely unbothered by his presence, her eyes still on Wonsiok. Before his father, before all of it. He used to laugh so loud the neighbors complained. She glanced past Wonsiok's shoulder toward her grandson, and her voice softened into something almost sad. I keep waiting for someone to remind him he still can. Junhyuk's jaw tightened, just barely, the way a man's does when something true has been said about him in front of exactly the wrong person. He did not step further into the room. He did not leave either. He stood in the doorway like a man caught between two versions of himself, the one his grandmother remembered and the one the world had built out of him since. And for once he had no idea which one to let Wonsiok see. Wonsiok looked between them, caught in a silence that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with him at the same time, and understood, without being told, that he had just been handed something Junhyuk had never meant for him to see. By the 3rd week, Wonsiok had stopped counting how many times a day he ended up in the same room as Junhyuk without meaning to. It happened in the garden most often, where Halmoni-do liked to sit with tea and pretend she wasn't arranging things. She'd ask Wonsiok to fetch a book from the study, and Junhyuk would already be there, reading something in a language Wonsiok didn't recognize, and neither of them would mention how unlikely that coincidence had become. You read classical Chinese, Wonsiok said one afternoon, more accusation than observation. My grandmother insisted. She said a man who can't read his own family's history has no right to lead it. Junhyuk didn't look up from the page. You sound surprised. I didn't expect it from someone who solves problems with a phone call and a black car. Every man needs somewhere his phone can't reach him. He finally looked up. You read too. I've seen the books in your bag. Second-hand paperbacks aren't the same as 500-year-old poetry. They're the same thing. Someone trying to say something true and hopping it survives. Something shifted in his voice, quieter than before. You'd be surprised how few people actually manage that, you'd know, since you spend most of your time making people afraid instead of listening to them. Listen plenty. I just don't waste words proving it. He set the book down between them, an invitation disguised as a shrug. Try me. Wonsiok hesitated, then read the line his thumb had landed on aloud, badly, his pronunciation rough around the older characters. Junhyuk corrected him without mockery, just once, and then said nothing when Wonsiok tried again and got it right. The silence that followed felt like something neither of them wanted to name. Later that week, a package arrived at his apartment with no note, no name, nothing but a single volume of poetry in a language he could actually read, its spine cracked soft from being opened many times before. He knew exactly who had sent it. He also knew exactly how he was supposed to react and did the opposite, carrying it back to the estate the next day to hand it back. I can't accept this. It's a book, not a debt. Everything you give me turns into a debt eventually. That's how this works with you. Wonsiok held it out, half hopping he'd just take it and end the conversation there. Junhyuk didn't move to take it, not at first. Is that really what you think this is? A ledger I'm keeping, waiting for you to owe me something back, isn't it? No. The word came out flatter than anything he'd said all afternoon, and more honest for it. Wonseok held the book out between them, half a refusal, half an excuse to stay standing closer than either of them needed to be. Junhyuk reached to take it back, and his hand stopped an inch from Wonseok's, close enough that neither man could pretend not to feel the space between them narrowing on its own. Neither of them moved to close it. Neither of them moved away either. Neither of them moved, and the space between their hands became the loudest thing in the room. Junhyuk's fingers closed the last inch first, slow enough that Wonseok could have stepped back and didn't. His skin was warm where Wonseok expected cold, careful where he expected force. And for a man who ran a world built on violence, his hands held the book like something that could still be broken. Outside, the garden had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists right before something changes for good. You should let go, Wonseok said, not letting go. I know, I mean it, nothing good comes from this. I know that too. Junhyuk's voice had lost every edge it usually carried, stripped down to something almost unrecognizable. I've spent 11 years making sure nothing could reach me. You reached me anyway, with a bike lock and an apartment I'm not allowed to pay for. I don't know what to do with that except tell you the truth. Then tell me. Think about you when I shouldn't. I have since the hospital corridor. I've told myself it's gratitude 100 different ways, and none of them have ever been true. He finally looked up, and whatever composure he'd built his entire life on had quietly left the room. I'm not asking you to want this back. I needed you to know it's real, whatever it costs me to say it. Wonseok's chest tightened around something he'd been refusing to name for weeks. This is insane. I know. You're the last person I should want. I know that too. He didn't say the words back. He didn't need to. He closed what remained of the distance between them instead, and the kiss that followed felt less like a decision, and more like something that had already been decided the moment a window shattered on a rainy overpass, and neither of them had known it yet. For one suspended moment, there was no empire, no gate, no history heavy enough to weigh either of them down. There was only warmth where there had been none in 11 years, and a strength in Wonseok's hands that surprised even him. Then Junhyuk's phone rang, and he didn't answer it right away, and it rang again, and something in the third ring made him finally pull back and check the screen. His thumb hovered over it a second longer than it should have, the way a man hesitates before opening a door he already knows leads somewhere bad. His whole posture changed before he even spoke. The warmth drained out of his face in real time, replaced by something colder and more familiar, the version of him that gave orders men didn't survive ignoring. Whatever the voice on the other end said, it was short, and it was enough. Have to go, he said. Here, lock the door behind me. His voice had already gone lethal, already somewhere else entirely. Don't open it for anyone but Soo-young. He was gone before Wonseok could ask what could possibly turn a man's whole voice to steel in the space of one phone call. Through the window, he watched the black car pull away faster than it had ever left before, and for the first time since the overpass, he felt something close to the fear he'd felt watching a stranger's hand go still against fogged glass. If you've ever felt your whole world shift in a single moment like that, let us know in the comments and stay close, because everything is about to change fast. Junhyuk came back at 4 in the morning with blood on his knuckles that wasn't his own, and Wonseok was still awake waiting for him at the door. He hadn't meant to wait up. He'd told himself twice to go home, and both times found himself sitting in the same chair by the window instead, watching the gate for headlights that took far too long to come. Neither of them said anything at first. Wonseok took his hand without asking permission, turned it over under the hallway light, checking for a wound underneath the blood that wasn't there. Junhyuk let him. He'd let very few people touch him like that in his entire life, and something about tonight had worn down whatever wall usually stopped him from allowing it. Someone tried to move on a shipment, Junhyuk said finally, before Wonseok could ask. Tonight it was that. Some nights it's worse. This is what I am, Wonseok. Not the man who reads poetry in the garden, the man who does whatever it takes to keep what's his. I know what you are. I've known since the hospital. You don't. Not really. You've seen the edges of it. You haven't seen what it actually costs the people around me." His voice had gone rough in a way it never had before, honesty stripped of every practiced calm he usually wore like armor. "My father built this empire the same way, and it cost him everything soft in himself until there was nothing left worth loving. I watched it happen to him. I've spent 11 years terrified of becoming exactly that, and tonight I did things that would have made him proud, and that terrifies me more than any threat I've ever handled. Are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to decide with your eyes open. I'm not a good person, but I am honest, at least with you, even when it costs me." He finally looked at Wonsiok directly, something raw and unguarded in his face that had nothing left to hide behind. "If you walk away tonight, I won't stop you. I won't send a car. I won't make it hard for you. You'll just be free of all of this, the way you should have stayed from the beginning." Wonsiok said nothing for a long time. He thought of the crowd on the overpass, phones raised, nobody willing to get close enough to something that looked dangerous even when it was simply someone who needed help. He thought of an old woman's hand slapping weakly against fogged glass, and a man standing over a bloodied bike lock because somebody else had reached her first. "Need to think," he said finally. "I'm not saying no. I'm not saying yes either. I just need tonight." Junhyuk nodded, like he'd expected exactly that answer and had already prepared himself for it to hurt anyway. "Take whatever time you need." Wonsiok left before sunrise, and Junhyuk stood in the doorway watching the same black car he'd once used to chase this man down, now driving him quietly away, wondering if honesty had cost him the only person who had ever wanted nothing from him at all. Soo-young found him still standing there an hour later and said nothing, only set a hand briefly on his shoulder before walking away, the closest thing to comfort either of them knew how to offer. The message arrived on a phone Wonsiok hadn't given the number to, 3 words long, and it turned his blood cold before he'd even finished reading it. "We know everything." He stared at it for a full minute before his hands started shaking. No name attached. No explanation. Just 3 words and a photograph underneath them, himself walking out of the estate gate at dawn, time-stamped, clearly taken by someone who had been watching for a while. He read it a second time, then a third, as if repetition might change what it said. It didn't. Whoever sent it had known exactly which morning to catch him, which meant they had known long before this message arrived. He called Soo-young first, because some instinct told him not to call Junhyuk directly, not yet, not until he understood what he was walking into. She answered on the second ring, and the silence after he read her the message told him everything before she said a word. "There are men inside Junhyuk's own circle who think you're a liability," she said finally, her voice tight in a way he'd never heard from her. "Not rivals, his own people. Some of them have wanted him weaker for years, easier to move against, easier to replace. You becoming something he'd bleed to protect gives them exactly the leverage they've been waiting for. Didn't anyone tell me this could happen? Because none of us thought he'd let anyone close enough for it to matter. He hasn't in 11 years. Then you happened and nobody accounted for it fast enough." Wonsiok's apartment suddenly felt smaller than it ever had, every window a possibility he hadn't considered before tonight. "What do they want?" "I don't know yet. But whoever sent that photograph wanted you to know they could reach you without him knowing. That's not a threat about money, Wonsiok. That's a warning about how close they've already gotten." He thought about walking away right then, the way Junhyuk had told him he was free to do. No car, no consequence, back to a life where nobody photographed him at dawn and left him wondering who else had been watching all along. He thought about the empire he'd almost decided he could live beside, and how quickly it had reached into his own home without him noticing. Then his phone buzzed again. A second message from the same unknown number, and this one didn't need 3 words to make its point. It was a photograph of Halmoni Du, taken through the same garden window she liked to sit beside every afternoon, time-stamped an hour ago. Whoever was behind this had walked close enough to her to take it without anyone in that house noticing, which meant Soo-young's warning had already come too late to matter. Wonsiok was already moving toward the door before he'd finished being afraid, because whatever decision he still owed Junhyuk an answer to, It clearly wasn't going to wait for him to think it through anymore. The gate was already open when Wonsiok's cab pulled up, which was wrong in every way that mattered, because that gate never stood open on its own. His hands were still shaking from the ride over, every streetlight blurring past too slow, every minute feeling like it belonged to someone else's nightmare instead of his own life. He ran through it anyway. He found Soo-young in the entryway pressing a cloth to a cut above her eyebrow, waving off help from two men who looked more shaken than she did, insisting in a voice that left no room for argument that she was fine, that Halmoni-do was fine, that Junhyuk had already handled it. Handled it how? Wonsiok asked, already moving toward the garden. He found the answer before Soo-young could give it. Two men he didn't recognize lay unconscious near the study door, and Junhyuk stood over them with blood on his shirt that this time was at least partly his own, breathing hard, red hair damp with sweat, looking every bit like the man his file had once made him sound like, and none of the man who read poetry in gardens. He looked up and saw Wonsiok, and something in his face broke open with relief before he could stop it. "You shouldn't have come here. Not tonight. Your grandmother's photograph was in my phone an hour ago. Where else would I go?" Halmoni-do appeared behind him then, unharmed, wrapped in a shawl, more furious than frightened. "I told them exactly what I thought of grown men sneaking around gardens like criminals," she said, and despite everything, Wonsiok almost laughed at how unbothered she sounded. Junhyuk sat down heavily on the garden bench once the house had gone quiet again, and Wonsiok knelt in front of him without being asked, checking the cut along his ribs with hands that had learned, over these past weeks, exactly how to be careful with him. Junhyuk let him, the way he had that first night, except this time there was nothing left between them to pretend about. "You didn't have to come back for me," Junhyuk said quietly. "After everything I told you, after I gave you a way out." "I know. Then why did you?" Wonsiok pressed the cloth gently against the wound and didn't look up right away, because the answer had been sitting in his chest for weeks, refusing to be spoken until exactly this moment found him. "Because I've spent my whole life being the one who shows up for people who never show up for me back. I didn't come here tonight because I owed you anything. I came because I love you and I don't know how to stop, and I've been terrified to say it out loud in case saying it made it real." Junhyuk went very still, the way a man does when he's waited so long to hear something that he's afraid moving might make it disappear. Behind them, Halmoni-do quietly stepped back inside, pulling Soo-young with her, leaving the garden to the two of them the way she'd probably been hopping to for weeks. "Say it again," Junhyuk said. "Love you." This time, neither of them looked away, and neither of them needed anything else said to know exactly where they stood. The men who sent that photograph never got a chance to try again. Whatever Junhyuk did in the days that followed happened quietly, off in rooms Wonsiok was never invited into and never asked about, and by the end of that week, the people inside his own circle who had underestimated how much he'd bleed to protect what mattered had learned exactly how wrong they'd been. Soo-young mentioned once, briefly, that the organization had never been steadier. She didn't explain further. Wonsiok didn't ask her to. Some things, he'd learned, were better left inside the walls that had always kept them. A year later, the garden looked different in spring than it had that first rainy afternoon, full of color instead of storm, and Halmoni-do sat exactly where she always sat, watching the two of them the way she'd been quietly orchestrating for longer than either of them had noticed at the time. "I knew the moment I saw you," Junhyuk said, watching Wonsiok cross the garden toward him with 2 cups of tea he hadn't been asked to bring, sitting outside a hospital room at 2 in the morning, refusing an envelope full of money like it had personally offended you. "You're only saying that now because it makes a good story. I'm saying it because it's true." He took the tea and let his hand rest a moment longer than it needed to over Wonsiok's. "Best decision I ever made, letting you walk through that gate." Wonsiok had his own gallery now, small, tucked into a quiet street 2 districts over, full of photographs he'd started taking again after years of believing he didn't have time for anything that didn't pay rent. Junhyuk had never once suggested funding it. He'd simply shown up to every opening, standing quietly near the back, letting Wonsiok's work speak for itself the way he'd once let a stranger's silence speak louder than any thank you he could have offered. The first photograph in that gallery, framed near the entrance where every visitor saw it first, was a bike lock resting on wet asphalt, taken from memory rather than any camera that had actually been there. Halmoni do like to tell people, whenever she got the chance, that her grandson had laughed exactly the way he used to as a boy, loud enough that the neighbors would complain. Ever since a poor courier smashed a window on an overpass nobody else wanted to stop for, Wonsiok never did learn who among the crowd had filmed instead of helped that day. It stopped mattering a long time ago. What mattered was a bike lock that still sat on a shelf in their bedroom, dark stain long since faded, kept there not as a reminder of what it cost him, but of what it gave him back. If this story found its way into your chest tonight, don't let it end here. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one, because there's always another story waiting to be told. Tell us in the comments what this one meant to you, what you felt, what stayed with you after the last word. And if it moved you even a little, share it with someone who needs a reminder that showing up for a stranger can change the whole shape of a life. Thank you for staying until the very end. We'll see you in the next story.